The primary purpose of Innovative AAC Solutions, the podcast, is to educate and inform. The views expressed during all episodes are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute educational or medical advice. They are not necessarily the views of Special School District of St. Louis County.
Everybody, we are back. It is season five of Innovative AAC Solutions. And I am so excited because we have a new face joining us, not new to SSD, but new to the podcast. On behalf of the podcast, I am welcoming and so excited to have my new co-host, Bridget Selberg. Bridget, hi.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm
So
excited to be here.
if someone doesn't know you already through the district, can you just let them know who you are and a little bit about you?
Sure. So this is my 12th year being an SLP. So 2 years I worked for a different district and 10 years with special school district. I worked for those 10 years in Rockwood. I've worked elementary schools, in middle schools, and then from ESY, I've had the experience of working with high schoolers and up to age 21. And I am passionate about helping SLPs really dig deeper into ODCOM because I know that it can feel very overwhelming, but that we all should be embracing these communicators and helping them reach their full potential.
I could not put it better myself. And I'm just so excited that you're going to be co-hosting this with me. I didn't like doing it by myself. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. It's always nicer to have somebody helping and just adding to the ideas, adding to the interviews. And so I'm so excited that you are going to be able to do that with us this season. Do you want to tell the listeners so last year we tackled literacy. What are we tackling this season?
This season's all about Gestalt language processing in AAC.
Yeah,
and which is pretty exciting because I feel like
yep.
I feel like it's one of those things where once you get a taste of it, you're like, oh, I'm seeing this everywhere. I'm seeing this in our students. And I feel like there's space for all of us to learn because although the research has been there since the 80s, that was a really big gap in my education.
Yeah, the research has been around a long time, and I think that we all have just felt a little lost with some of our students that we're supporting, especially our AAC users. And this feels like it connects and it makes so much sense. And it's what I tell people is it's like once you open it up, you can't unsee it. You just start to see it everywhere you look, and it just starts to connect. The lines, I think of like the connect the dots sheets, and you're like, it just makes sense. And yeah, you and I have been digging, have been trying to think of who would be the best people to have on to talk about. So I'm so excited about some of the interviews that we have to share, some of the resources we have to share. Any ahas that you are excited to dive into more, or what do you feel like is the most important thing you've learned so far about GLP or Gestalt language processing, as you mentioned?
I feel like the biggest thing is how to help people in the trenches, how to help us educators and give us practical tips because that's what people want, not just to understand, but how to apply this. What about you?
For me, it's the trenches, but it's the connection piece, right? It's that moment where you're going to see that student that you feel like wasn't paying attention or wasn't picking up on things, or you just thought maybe it was a coincidence that one time. And you're like, oh my gosh, like that was intentional. Like we're connecting. I'm enjoying this so much more. I'm feeling like the pieces are finally coming together and we're making progress. I hope for these students. And I've seen that informally, so I can't wait to talk about it more formally and share some of the tips, the tricks, and the insight that so many of the interviewees have to share. And well, you have to share too, because you created some of our resources this year and you you're just an amazing resource for our department, and I can't wait for everyone to learn from you too.
Well, thank you. I'm excited to be here and I'm excited to share, especially hearing what our interviewees have to share because, they have a wealth of knowledge and it's so exciting to dive deeper into this topic.
So, speaking of a wealth of knowledge, we are going to get started with a bang. We have, for our first interview this season, we have the wonderful Emily Diaz on, and we are going to talk all about an introduction to just what Gestalt language processing means for AAC. And so, let's say, without further ado, let's just jump into our interview with Emily Diaz. Hey, everybody, welcome back to Innovative AAC Solutions, the podcast. And I get to introduce you to one of my favorite people, and I get to introduce you to our new season that we have decided we are dedicating all to Gestalt language processing and AAC. So on that note, I would love to introduce you to our first guest, Emily Diaz. Emily, thank you so much for jumping on today.
Yeah, Laura, thanks for having me. I didn't realize the whole podcast was dedicated to AAC and GLP. This is exciting.
Yes, the whole season. I think we have 14 episodes and we are almost done with all of our interviews. We have so many exciting people on, but we wanted to jumpstart with you because, again, we were off the air. We were talking about how we could just talk about this all day.
Oh, yeah. This is exciting.
Super exciting. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about your path and background as an SLP. And then how did you discover GLP?
Yeah, I feel like my story's probably pretty similar to most in that I didn't know about GLP until years after graduating. Like in the job, working, things aren't working, like therapy, we're not making progress. But let me backtrack a little bit. So I graduated as an SLP in, I think it was 2015. And my very first job was in a school district. And I had taken over for an SLP who had worked in that district at that campus for her entire career, like 40 plus years. And I was just this little baby CF. Yeah, this little baby CF coming in who like felt like she couldn't say anything because, oh, well, that's not how so-and-so used to do it, right? You know, that whole thing. So I wound up working in that position with like the same group of kids for like 7 years. So I had a really long time with some kids that I started with in middle school and then saw them all the way through high school in our 18 plus program. And the thing about the caseload that I was working with at the time was that nobody had AAC, but they all needed AAC, but I didn't really know what AAC was. And so I spent about a year trying to figure out like, how do you do therapy with this type of student? And like nothing was working. It was super frustrating. I think I had one kid transfer in from another district and he had an AAC device. And I was like, oh, what's that? Because whatever that is what all of my other kids need. And so I went on this journey trying to learn as much as I could about AAC. And anytime I do like a training or presentation, I always start off by telling people that I didn't learn anything about AAC in grad school. And the reason why that's important is because any SLP, any parent, any OT, any other professional has the capacity to learn about AAC. Like you don't need a degree in speech pathology to do that. And I'm proof of that because I spent years trying to figure out what are the different systems, what are the different access methods. And I joined like a networking cohort so that I could learn what other districts were doing with AAC. So once all of that was set in stone, plot twist, then I started to hear about Gestalt language processing on Instagram of all places, which I feel like social media has come such a long way in terms of like how educating it is and just like you can actually learn research-based things on Instagram, which there's probably a group of people who think you shouldn't learn anything from Instagram. But that's where I first heard about Gestalt language processing. And it was Alex's account, Meaningful Speech, that she had started posting back in like, I don't even know what it was, 2022, 2021.
I think, yeah, either early
Somewhere
2022 or late 2021, I think is what she said. Yeah.
Yeah. And I just like binged whatever content she had on there at that point. And again, I was like, this explains all of the kids that aren't making progress on my caseload. like got them the AAC devices. Like, why is it still not working? And her course was closed at that time. Like she was revamping it. So I was like holding out to try to take this course. I'm like, I have to learn about this. And as soon as it was available, that's the first place that I learned about Gestalt language processing was in the meaningful speech course. And that was like game changer for the kids that I was working with. I wanted so badly to jump in a time machine and go back 5 years and start working with them all over again. But when you know better, you do better and you move forward with what you can. And now I work with some younger kids that I'm able to get in, you know, on a younger level with them. The kids I was working with at that point were high schoolers. And I was like, man, we got to go back in time and start over with this. So yeah, that's really most of my journey up to this point. I don't work full time in the schools anymore. I've shifted into private practice. I really wanted to specialize in AAC and now Gestalt language processing. There's so much red tape and hoops to jump through in school districts. I was getting really burnt out with the caseload and workload that I had, and feel like I can make a bigger impact and enjoy what I do better if I went off on my own. So that's kind of where I'm at now.
And there is such a need for it too. You know, there's so many times I'll be like, hey, I'm not able to help, but like I know somebody who can coach you. And there's such a need for that for families that don't have facilitators that can help them within their districts. It sounds like you didn't necessarily have a mentor that could guide you that knew a lot about AAC at the time that you were in the schools, starting off fresh, eager to learn, right? Like you had all the skills, but you just didn't have that person that you could run to. And so that need is there, right? Not just for AAC, but Gestalt language processing. So let's pretend like, Emily, let's pretend like I don't know anything about Gestalt language processing. You know, someone who's new to that term might say, well, why would it matter? Why weren't your strategies working? Like, why didn't they make progress? So let's go back to the beginning and let's just define it and then talk about the difference between Gestalt language development and analytic language development. What does that look like?
Yeah. So what most of us as SLPs have learned, like in grad school, language development wise, is all analytic language focused. And you probably didn't even realize it was called analytic language. But when we're comparing and contrasting the two different language processing types, that's what we have: analytic language processing and Gestalt language processing. And the best way that I've been able to understand the differences between them, and I don't know if it was Marge that coined this terminology or Alex or both, it's all muddled together at this point, but analytic language processors are word babies, and then the Gestalt language processors are intonation babies. The analytic language processors start with single words, then we combine 2 words, then we have 3-word utterances, 4-word utterances. We're tracking MLU and it's becoming very generative, all of those things. On the flip side, our Gestalt language processors, we call them intonation babies because of the intonation in the scripting that they're using. And so if you're talking about Gestalt language processing, you'll often hear scripting or delayed echolalia as common terminology that gets bundled up in there. So our Gestalt language processors, our GLPs, they acquire these like long multi-word utterances. Usually it's a long multi-word utterance or script, often from media in this day and age. I feel like back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it was probably mom, dad, and teacher, whatever they were saying. But now we've got iPads like in front of our faces all the time. And tons of TV shows that kids are picking up scripts from. And so these kids, they appear very like grammatically sophisticated early on, but sometimes what they're saying doesn't quite match the context or the scenario. You have to do this detective work to kind of figure out, what do they mean by that? Where did that come from? And they wind up having to really break down all those multi-word utterances and scripts in order to get to that single word level that our analytic language processors start with, so that then they can become spontaneous and more generative with their own language production. And then there's the whole natural language acquisition framework, which is how a Gestalt language processor would make it from scripting all the way to like complex grammar.
And that was coined and developed with the work that Marge Blanc did. So
yes,
so much credit to her. And I don't know, did you end up reading Natural Language Acquisition, the book as well?
I have the book. I don't know that I ever read it cover to cover, but it's certainly been a really good resource to like, if I need to dig in specifically to like stage 2 and I'm like, okay, let's go learn about mitigations again. I got to refresh my memory. Super good resource.
Yeah. And I wanted to tag onto that because I think sometimes people think that it has to be really long for it to be a gestalt, right? But when we
Yeah.
think about soundtracks, can be really long, like all of the movies, or, some of our kids might have an entire gestalt be the entire episode or the entire
Yep.
song, and like you can't get them to stop. Like that could be an example, but it could also be really short. And
Yeah.
so they might disguise themselves like they're in costume as an ALP, like an analytic language processor, because they have only single words, but they're
Yes.
not making progress, right? And so they're a Gestalt language processor disguised as an ALP. So it can be as long as an entire song. It can be as short as a single word or sound.
Yep.
But the key that you hit on is that it's about the intonation. They're tying it to a meaningful experience that meant something to them,
Yep.
and they're not focused on the actual word or phrase or sentence or entire song itself. They're focused
Yeah.
on the soundtrack.
I'm so glad you added that. When I do trainings on Gestalt language processing, and I am like, there's a little caveat where sometimes a single word can be a stage one, and it's like, what? Which is kind of a little nuanced part. I mean, all of natural language acquisition is very nuanced and very child specific. Like, no one thing applies to everyone, I feel like. But that is an important thing to mention. I like how you use the word like they're disguised, right? Because if you're hearing single words, you might not jump to Gestalt language processing right off the bat. And then we notice that those single words are stuck single words and they don't ever combine with anything else. And that, it's only used in one context. Yeah, that was really important to add.
Well, but like you pointed out, the way that we help them progress naturally through language development, the one other thing that Alex always mentions and Marge always mentions is that this is not a diagnosis. This is a natural
Yes.
way to develop language. So you may see, we have lots of adults out there that they never needed therapy. That's just how they acquired language. They will speak to that. But if you are seeing these kids get stuck in single words and not make progress with your strategies, chances are they could be a Gestalt language processor. That's
Yep.
just, yeah. So what about our kids that are AAC users or might benefit from AAC? We talked about some signs that you
Mhm.
might be a GLP, and maybe we need to add a few more, but what would we be looking for if we're like, I don't know how do I know if they're an ALP or a GLP? Where do I start?
Yeah. So the thing I always start with is telling people that you are not going to do harm by erring on the side of GLP, because so many of the strategies and approaches that we use with that type of language learner are still usable for analytic language processors. However, the opposite is not true. If you happen to have a GLP and you're using ALP, analytic language approaches, then you might get stuck. So for me, I'm like, let's err on the side of GLP. If we need to start using some phrases, we need to increase our intonation. Like, what harm is that going to do for any kid? I think that's really beneficial part of language development and just the modeling. But in terms of like our non-speakers, whether they're already using AAC or they haven't yet used AAC, sometimes we'll still hear really long strings of scripts, but it's not language that they're scripting. It's jargony, or it's musical, or it's very, just like sound driven. It's vowels, right? And you hear that same sound over and over and over again that they're stimming on, is what some people will say. And it's like, well, let's tune into that a little more and not just write it off as stimming. And I know you've done a whole presentation on that, which everyone needs to listen to because it's so, so important. A lot of times these kids, like I said, very musical, like the humming or the rich intonation. Replaying portions of videos is a big tip off to me. If they're, on YouTube or their Disney Plus app, and it's like, gotta rewind, gotta rewind, gotta rewind. Especially if they're holding the iPad like right up to their ear. So many of my kids do that. Rewind, hold it up, rewind, hold it up. That's almost to me like a signal of receptive, like Gestalt intake of like, I need to hear that whole thing over again and store it for later. A lot of times with these kids, if they're not making good progress with the approaches that you've been using for years, like I said, I finally figured out to get AAC for my students, and 3 years later, we're still not making progress. And it's like, oh, there's a whole other piece to this that I'm totally missing. And then we talked just a minute ago about like those stuck single words. So I think of kids who we've introduced an AAC device to, we've done what the research tells us to do, which is model core words and go hard on the core words. And then all of a sudden we're just stuck with single core words, and like we're not combining words, and we don't have any fringe words that we're adding in. So that might be something to tell me, like, we've got to change our approach with how we're modeling and programming our AAC device in order to give them more access to different language functions, more vocabulary, and all of that.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. I love every little point of that, because we definitely see that here too. And, we see, we don't have an exact number, but we know that it can be something that we frequently see with our autistic students and our autistic
Yes.
patients that we're working with. So it's not like a tip off if they're autistic that they automatically are a Gestalt language processor, but it does make you really kind of hone in on, maybe I need to really look and see how they're communicating. So we're going to dive into some do's and don'ts. So we've foreshadowed that already, right? We've said like, there's some things you definitely don't want to do, but I think it would be important. We mentioned briefly the framework, the natural language acquisition framework. We talked about how analytic language development works. How does, according to the NLA, natural language acquisition framework, how does that look? What would progression to autonomous, fluid communication look like for someone who's a Gestalt language processor?
Yeah, so I'll just quickly review some of the stages and mention like, how do you move from one stage to another, and just know that it's very child specific. You also don't ever exist in one single stage. I think we can get really hung up on language sampling and like which one is the most, but like you will never have 100% of a stage. It is very like fluid. You can move backwards, you can move forwards, you could be in two different stages at the same time. So there's a lot of nuance there, like we've already mentioned. But there are 6 stages total, from stage 1 to stage 6. Once you get to stage 4, stages 4, 5, and 6 all kind of go together in terms of grammar development. And that's like more advanced language. But between stages 1 and 4 is where we see the most dramatic difference and the most progress happen. So in stage 1, that's where we'll be hearing that echolalia, specifically delayed echolalia, immediate echolalia. That's a whole other story. But the scripting, like we said, it could be really long utterances, could be those single stuck words, but that's our stage 1 kid. Stage 2 is where you'll start to hear that word mitigation. Some people will say it's like a mix and match stage, but that's where the breaking down, the trimming down, and then this like mixing and matching of the gestalts from stage 1 start to happen. And it's very experimental, and it's kind of this like, we're not quite spontaneous yet, but we're getting really creative with how can I be more flexible with these gestalts and these scripts that I've been using? And then our job as, language partners is to be able to offer models for how could we be mitigating this gestalt in order to lead to more flexible language. And this is all very simplified, of course, and then moving to stage 3 is where you'll start to hear more of those single words and 2-word combinations, usually noun or noun adjective. You won't hear any verbs happening in stage 3, because if you're hearing a verb and it seems spontaneous, that's stage 4. That's our introduction to grammar. If you're hearing verbs before that, it's probably from one of their scripts. Like we said, like they appear very grammatically complex early on, and it almost seems like a regression at some point, that it's like, whoa, all of a sudden we're at single words now. He was talking so much more before, but like that's the turning point for where we get to unlock this more natural language. That happens in stage 4, where we get to unlock all that grammar. We start looking through the DSS and figuring out all the syntactic types that we can model for them. And then stages 5 and 6 are that more advanced and complex grammar.
Yeah. And I love how you use that word flexible, right? So in early stages, things for Gestalt language processors are very inflexible, right? They may use them out of context, or you may see like that's like, why is he saying that? That's something from Mickey Mouse Club. That's not something that applies to this, right? But it's really long. So it sounds like grammar, but it's inflexible. So we haven't necessarily, what Marge and Alex would say, is free those words. They're not free. They're not flexibly exchangeable. And that's what we see with our AAC users, right? We may see overgeneralized motor patterns. We may see them use a word, but it's not flexible in and out of context.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So we've kind of gone over the framework. We'll definitely share some. I think that's one of those things I have to see to like really absorb it and dive into resources. So we'll share that in the notes. But like you mentioned this earlier, what are the do's? You know, the things, if we're using these strategies with all of our kids, it could be helpful. Like what are the do's for helping these?
Yeah. So I'm actually, if you don't mind, I'm going to share don'ts, but I'm going to tell you what to do instead. Like, it's not just this negative list of like, don't do this, don't do that. So here's the don't, but here's what you can do instead. And all of these things that I'm listing out as don'ts are things that I have done before myself. So like, I don't want anyone listening to take this as like, oh my God, I'm a failure when it comes to implementing AAC. Like, these are all things that I have learned from and moved on from myself. And I want others to be able to do the same. So the very first like don't in terms of AAC for a Gestalt language processor is to get stuck modeling only single words. And we know that we have really good research to support like the importance of core vocabulary. And I'm not saying that we need to get rid of the core vocabulary. I think that's like the opposite end of the spectrum that people go. It's like, what do you mean we have to get rid of the core words? No. Don't get rid of the core words. I'm just saying, don't put all of your eggs in the core word basket. We've got to have phrases. We've got to have mitigations, you know, depending on what stage they're in. But getting hung up only modeling the core words is going to cause some of these kids to get really stuck and not make progress. And that's what happened with a lot of the kids I was working with. So rather than fixating so much on modeling single words for all students, let's be a little bit more flexible ourselves by using some pre-programmed phrases. A lot of our AAC systems come with pre-programmed phrases. I'm thinking like quick fires and topics inside of TD Snap. Touch Chat has the chat folder with a bunch of phrases. Like, this is not something that's out of the box thinking. Like, it's in most of the systems already. And if there's any individualized gestalts that we can add in, let's add those in too. The next thing that is a big don't, and this is a don't for like any AAC user, whether they're GLP or not, hiding words or pages that they're stimming on. Because like we talked about, that could be part of their scripting. We don't have a ton of scripted output, but we have the scripted input that they're trying to listen to. I had a kid early on when I was working in the schools who during our morning meeting would go straight into the keyboard of his AAC device and start scripting out like a sports broadcast from the night before. And we were like, that's off topic. We're talking about weather. We're talking about calendar. And like, all he wanted to do was tell us about what he did yesterday. And like, I probably had asked a question of like, what did you guys eat for dinner last night? Which jogged his memory of like, I was watching sports while I was eating dinner, start scripting the entire broadcast. We wound up hiding the keyboard page on his device, which is like, don't do that. Like, I feel like if I had leaned in and connected with what he was trying to say in that moment and worked with that, like, we could have made so much more progress. I want to go back in time and like tell myself, don't do that. So don't jump to hiding words or pages because kids are stimming on them. There might be more to that. We already talked about pre-programmed phrases. Like, don't just focus on single words, make sure there's pre-programmed phrases, but also don't only put pre-programmed phrases in the device. Like, I have talked to some SLPs, like I said, who think, oh, no core words. Okay, I'll delete all of those. And then on the homepage, I'll have let's, and then all these options for what we're going to do. So we need a balance. That's the do, is have a balance of pre-programmed phrases with your single words. And then the last one is don't use guided access for all kids. And I know that this is, again, very nuanced. Like, if you work for a school district where your devices are managed and you can't do that as an option, to unlock guided access, right? So like they could be on YouTube or Disney Plus or wherever they're scripting from. Like we've seen kids go into Google Maps and like find McDonald's, and that's how they're telling us they want French fries for lunch. So I know for me, like I was always really hard on like, we've got to have guided access on. It's an iPad. This needs to be a dedicated device. That's the closest way we can make it dedicated, until I started working with kids who were using other apps on the device to communicate with me. I have a little boy right now who uses the Apple Music app, and it's not organized in there at all. He'll just like scroll, find a song, pull up the lyrics to the song, scroll to the part in the lyrics where he wants to tell me that he's feeling sad. And I'm like, how am I going to take that away from him by locking down his device and say, well, no, tell me that inside of Perliquo to go instead. So that's don't err on the side of guided access if possible. Keep an open mind and let them explore these other apps that they might actually be communicating with too.
And you keep circling around this idea too, that I think we need to highlight about how we have to interpret how they're communicating, right? We have to get curious and look at this creative forms of communication, whether that be scripting the sports, the news from the night before.
Yep.
And you're like, well, that doesn't seem appropriate. But like now, if we get to be good detectives, we're like, well, it actually doesn't mean that. It actually means that I'm trying to share about home, or I'm dysregulated. I had someone who we had it open, like you were saying, and every day it was the Cocomelon cleanup song. And so it was just a transition song that he was explaining, like, okay, I know it's time to transition. Well, then one day pulled up the Lion King stampede scene, and come to find out from home, he had a terrible night. Some really big, bad things had happened. And it was like, had we not seen that deviation, we would have not known. And so it probed the team to get curious and start that communication with family of, okay, well, what does that actually mean? So I love that you're giving us like this, don't take things literally, do the detective work and figure out either through multimedia maps, like you mentioned, or through how they're using the device, figure out how they're communicating.
Yeah, all of that's really important, and definitely not something that I would have been tuned into if all my kids had guided access on their iPads. We'd just be stuck with whatever happened to be in their AAC system.
Yeah. And I love how you gave the example too in the classroom of just don't force the appropriate response, right?
Yes.
In those early stages, they're so tied to the meaning and the experience and that child. Like that's why we really, when you look into some of these resources, child-led is at the forefront of it, because until you meet them where they're at, they're not flexibly using things yet. They're not ready for comprehension questions till later stages. They're not ready for all that academic content that you want to ask them. We need to meet them where they're at. It's not to say they won't get there. It's just they're not there yet.
Yes. Love that.
Okay, so that leads us into the next idea of where is the best place to start for someone who's maybe an early GLP in those early stages.
Yeah, I think what we know, so if we're thinking specifically about AAC users, what we know in the AAC research that works for AAC users, for the most part, still applies to Gestalt language processors. And I think we as professionals can get really hung up on the fact that there's no current research for Gestalt language processing, for AAC in Gestalt language processing. Never mind the fact that we're ignoring like the other two parts of the evidence-based triad, but the AAC research that we have is still good research. And I love what Kate Flaxman said at ATIA back like a couple years ago about good AAC is still good AAC, and good AAC research is still good AAC research. And we know that modeling is a huge part of development for AAC users. And that is like the biggest thing that communication partners can be doing. And if anyone listening has heard me talk on Instagram or at another training before, you know that I am huge on training communication partners in order to provide modeling opportunities and implement AAC. And that you'll never find me in an IEP meeting saying, let's increase speech therapy time because the more you work with me, the better you're going to get with AAC, because that is so not how it works. We need all the communication partners, all the stakeholders to be involved. And really the same thing applies for Gestalt language processors. If we can train communication partners to acknowledge and accept scripting, to understand what the stages are, to understand that we need to be modeling not only the core words, but also these phrases, use the phrases that are already in there. Or if we have a kid, it's like, whoa, we programmed 10 of the gestalts, that he's using, and then we're going to plan for mitigations with that. And just having this awareness around what that framework looks like. And like you said, just being child-led, acknowledging their gestalts, building that connection with them, because gestalts are so emotionally relevant for these kids. That connection piece is going to be huge. Sensory supports go into that as well. So all of that to say, that's the best place to start for communication partners. Keep modeling, know why and how you should be modeling, and be aware of what Gestalt language processing looks like, what the NLA framework looks like, and focus on that connection piece as well.
Yeah, we kind of breezed by the acknowledgement piece, but that is another one of those things. There's so much to this topic, but that is so crucial and huge. I mean, I know you have had that kid too, where it's like you are working with them. And then now that we know, we're not ignoring the echolalia, we're not ignoring it, whether it be immediate or delayed, we're just going to acknowledge it. And then all of a sudden they look up at you like, oh yeah, you understood me. And you're like, this is what I've been missing.
Is it Marge who calls it the bingo eye contact, or was it Alex who said that?
I feel like, I don't know. It doesn't matter. It is.
But it's what it is. I'm thinking back to one of the kids at the high school I worked at, where the first month of learning about Gestalt language processing, and it's like, where do I start? It's like, let's start by acknowledging these kids. And he's singing Old MacDonald, and then you start singing it with him, and all of a sudden he's like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
We're doing
this
together.
The same language. Yes.
You're not telling me to stop singing and focus on what we're working on right now. And just you literally get that locked in moment. It might not be literally eye contact, but the pause and breathing, or just the smile that comes up, that they're inching a little closer in proximity to you. And all of those little things over time build that connection and the trust, and the language will come after that.
And that leads me to one other little tip that I have to say, because I think we fall into it a lot with our AAC users, which is don't fall into the I want pattern. It is on the homepage. And that child, you may be tempted to just say, okay, it looks like they are really into the bubbles, so I'm going to have them say, I want bubbles. Well, if you start with the acknowledgement piece, first of all, you're going to tune in, and they may not be saying I want bubbles. Maybe they're saying these bubbles are cool. I like how they pop. And maybe that's where we start. But again, those are the kinds of things, if we start with what we think is appropriate, and we're feeding that language, that's learned language. That is not going to help them on that Gestalt language development track. And so we got to be really careful, not to say we shouldn't model. But when we start to model I need help, I want this, it feels like slot fillers, and that's just not going to help them naturally progress.
Yeah, that was a good point to add.
Well, what other resources would you add? I feel like we're getting more and more resources. I know the research is going to come, but what resources are out there that we haven't already talked on?
I mean, we've touched on Marge Blanc's natural language acquisition book, the orange book. If you're not familiar with it, you need that one. That's the original, I feel like. And then of course, Alex's courses with meaningful speech. I mean, she has the original one, and now there's one that's on AAC and GLP that you helped her put together, and all of that information is just gold in there.
Emily is skipping over the fact that she also wrote a bonus course for that.
I did. Okay, you can find me in there too. I talk about LAMP specifically for Gestalt language processors. I forgot there's all those bonus modules in there. Yes, every single AAC app that you could think of that your kids might be using, there's a whole 30-minute 40, I think mine's 45 minutes. That's a pretty good chunk of time to talk about one AAC app. So those are really good resources. We talked about Instagram earlier. I don't think you should always get all of your information from Instagram, but I think you can learn new things on Instagram that kind of sets you down the path of ooh, I should go learn more about that. I should read the research on this. I should take a course on that. I should join a cohort. Something like that. So there's more and more people talking about Gestalt language processing now, and it's becoming I don't know why it was taboo to begin with, but it's becoming less and less taboo and more mainstream, and shifting this focus away from like being so hung up on the stages and just like, okay, we need to start with connection. We need to be child led. All of like that piece, I think, is people just glossed over that and got so hung up on stages that they forgot how to like play with a child and just connect with them first. And it's like, why isn't he making progress?
Yes.
Let's connect first. Yeah.
Exactly. And then, I think you're mentioning all these different types of learning. There's as much or as little as micro and as macro as you want to get, right? So the whole season of the podcast, keep following along here, because we're going to do some medium types of learning and diving into GLP and AAC.
Love
but
that.
you did a presentation for AAC in the cloud as well that's completely free that people can tap into. And then Marge also has those Northern Speech Service webinars that if you want to do some more heavy duty learning, those I think are several hours long. Yeah. And like you said, there's some really good social media accounts that we could, if you want to do some more micro learning, I like, I think any type of even research, right? If we read research, we try to be unbiased in the research that's out there, but a good person once said, like, research is still is as unbiased as you want it to be. It's still through a lens, right? And we have to look at it as consumers. And so regardless of what we're taking in, be a good consumer, look at how it applies. And you keep hitting on this, Emily, is be individualized in your approach.
Yes.
So really look at the kid that's in front of you and don't try to fit a mold, right? Like, we're not going to throw everybody. We have this tendency to do it in the schools more often than not, where we're like, okay, well, I have this group. And so I'm just going to do this activity, and I'm going to have these picture cards, and the entire group is going to do them. And I'm not, and I recognize there are limitations, and I have been in this situation, but if the more individualized we can get, the more we're tuning into their needs, their communication style, their goals. Okay. So before we land this plane, I have to ask you what we ask every single person that comes on the podcast. Bonus points if it's GLP related, but doesn't have to be. What is your favorite AAC moment to date?
It's not GLP related. I get no bonus points. It's still a really cool story though. So back when I was working in the school district, we had a little boy come in with very, very, very complex needs, like complex body, complex communication, complex vision, like all of this on paper, right? And I'm like, has anybody tried any alternative access AAC methods with him, right? Because his hands were really non-functional. His paperwork said he was blind, right? So everyone's like, Emily, you're crazy for thinking that we're even going to be able to try something. Like, just keep him comfortable, love on him, let him be here at school. And I'm like, if nobody's tried before, like, you will never know. Who told you that he was blind? Did he tell you that he was blind? Because he doesn't have a way to tell you that. I don't believe it until I see it. So I called one of my AAC reps out to bring an eye tracking device. And I was like, let's just see. This technology is really cool. You can see their eyes like pop up on the screen. Do we have one eye that's tracking? All I need is one eye tracking. We can position it any way that we want, because he was like reclined in a wheelchair. He was in like a big comfort bean bag for like most of the day. All of the team came, which is like, nobody ever does that when I do an evaluation. No one's that interested.
No pressure. Yeah.
No, I had like the VI specialist there, OT, PT, another speech therapist, the teachers. They're like, if this works, like, this is crazy. He's blind. Everyone's saying, right? So we get it set up and his eyes are on the screen. We pull up one of the games where it's like you follow the shooting star or something like that. And he's doing it. And everyone's faces are just like in shock. And so I'm like, okay, let's put up vocabulary. I don't care what vocabulary, right? You know, when you're working with alternative access, you've got to learn the access before you can get to the language piece. But I'm like, let's just try. And he did it. And that's my favorite moment so far, is everyone telling me this kid's blind. He can't use an eye gaze device. And I'm like, let's just try. And his little eyes popping up on the screen, and everyone was just like in shock over it. That's my favorite. What's your favorite? Do you share your favorite on that?
I don't know if I ever have. I really have to think about that. I have a few. I had one adult user who had, for whatever reason, he didn't have a device, and he I think he had a frustration. He was an adult with CP and he had frustration. And so he was like, it's too hard. I don't want to use it. And I said, well, let's just try one more time. You're in a work setting. You need it. And so I got him something. And 3 months in, I met with him and I said, how's it going? And he said it was going great and he couldn't wait to use it. And I said, well, you're just a great person and I really want you to have something. So his reply was, God makes wonderful people and I'm one of them. And I was like, heartbroken, like to the past.
Oh,
So yeah.
those are good stories. I love it. I love it. It's hard to ever just pick one. There's like, in general, the AAC moment that happens with like almost every kid is like the aha moment of like, oh, it's working, right?
Yes.
After all those months of modeling. And it's like, I don't know if he's getting it or he's not using it functionally, like whatever it is. And then that one time that's like, oh, did he just, and then everyone looks at each other and it's like, he did. And like, now you've got the real buy-in is that
Yeah.
when that moment happens, we can steamroll forward real
Yes.
fast.
It's the goosebump moment, right? It's like did that happen? Like,
Yeah.
of course it happened. Like, let's stop. And I always tell people this with GLPs. If you think it's a coincidence, it's likely not a coincidence.
Yep.
You know, I worked with somebody, I went to a conference and I met a GLP non-speaker and I handed him my phone and he went to my photos, scrolled through the photos, found a video of my daughter watching a Disney movie. And his favorite thing in the whole wide world is to talk about Disney movies.
Oh
And I
my
was like,
gosh.
I mean, like thousands of photos. And he went to it within 0.2 seconds. And I was like, that's not a coincidence. I would have thought that was a coincidence 10 years ago. Now I know. And like he
Yeah.
got that big old smile on his face. And I was like, dang, like these are the
Yeah.
moments. These are the moments that we live for. So if they had a question, they needed some support, I know you do coaching and you share resources. You've got a lot of digital supports that people can tap
Yeah.
into. What are those points? We'll put them in the notes, but what's the best way to
Yeah.
follow up?
Instagram is a good place to connect with me. I'm on there every day. So it's Emily Diaz SLP on Instagram. You can pop in my DMs, leave a comment on a reel or a post. I'm in my stories every day if you want to follow along of like what's she got going on this week. I share a lot about like real life, what I'm doing. And I don't just share AAC in there. Like it's life. I'm a person too, not just an SLP. And then on my website, which is www.emilydiazslp.com, you can get the free resource library access. You can look up information about coaching and consulting, all those types of things you can find on my website as well. There's a contact form on there too if you need to like send a longer message that'll get sent to my email and we can connect that way too.
Love it. Okay. Well, on behalf of the podcast, we just want to thank you for being on. Thank you guys for listening. Be sure to check out these upcoming episodes if you're interested in more and go give Emily a follow and check out her resources. They're amazing. And thanks, Emily, for being on.
Thanks, Laura.
Hi, it's Bridget. I wanted to share with you an activity. It's a story kit called Shopping with Walmart, and it comes along with a pen friend. So this is such a great activity, especially for Gestalt language processors. It's all kind of built in with those really nice gestalts. So it's great pictures. Let's go shopping. I can find the book. Really great medical phrases within it, but then also with the activity planner that goes along with it, I put in some more. So like you could say, I see the book if you want to kind of go off script from beyond just what's written in that text. And then the other thing is with Pen Friend, our students can have an independent learning opportunity on their own after you've done this in therapy or you've done this in the classroom to hear and just have that continuous independent practice, which I think is really going to be helpful for our students, especially if they enjoy kind of these special interests like shopping at Walmart or something like that. For stage 2, very medical. So it's a movie. Let's go. I can find it. Look here. Stage 3, just kind of breaking down those gestalts. Shopping cart, new shirt, new shoes, cool toys. So I think that this would be a really great activity. And then it also has inside actual items in both of them. So you could play like a memory game if they're in stage 3. You could also just, kind of do like a seek and find throughout your classroom using like ticky tack and hanging them up, or get them to have a flashlight and go look for it and turn off the lights in the classroom if that sounds like a fun idea. So just really kind of a really fun way to tap into literacy and support Gestalt language processing and get some independent practice in too. So this is found at the IRC, really great resource. There's a variety of these story kits. This one is shopping at Walmart, and the story kits come with a pen friend included. They come with the items included to do like a memory game, and it has the printed out colored version of the book. Really great resource. Hope you guys check it out.